Mayors from more than 24 Ontario municipalities gathered today in Guelph. They're sounding an alarm over the provincial government's recent moves, including some cuts to funding cities rely on, money municipalities had been expecting in their already passed budgets. It's part of a number of spending cuts planned in the province as the government works to eliminate its $11.7 billion deficit. But Ontario's mayors are begging Ford to postpone those municipal cuts. They say rushing them will force cities to either raise taxes or reduce services. So will the government consider pressing pause? Steve Clark is Ontario's Minister of Municipal Affairs, and he joins us now from Toronto. Hi, Minister Clark. Great to see you again. Thank you for your time.
Hi, Vashti. Thanks for having me on the show.
Minister, following the statement from the mayors who attended that meeting today, I wanted to ask you, why not press pause, work with municipalities and figure out how to get the savings you're looking for into the next municipal budget cycle in a way that doesn't impact the delivery of essential services?
Our government faced a tremendous financial hole when we took office, and I understand the concern that Ontario's large urban mayors have. I'm a former mayor and a former CAO myself, and I understand that when you have a situation like we have in the province, when Ontario and our municipalities have a different fiscal year, that any time a government makes changes, that's part of our fiscal year, it creates a very unique challenge for our municipal partners. But I spoke to them today, and I was encouraging them to focus on the challenges that they have this year, which in most cases is probably around 1% or less. And that let's focus on those changes, and let's continue to collaborate and continue to work together on situations that affect both of us.
I guess it depends, though, who you're talking to. For example, in Toronto, they've highlighted various cuts in, let's just say with public health. They're claiming it's more than $60 million from their budget this year. That's a lot of money to have to find in an area that many would argue, like for vaccines, for clean water, is very essential.
I've spoken to the ministry, and I think in some cases, some of the numbers that are being quoted are not the same numbers that I'm getting. In the case of public health, the number that I have for the City of Toronto is around 33 million. And regardless of the numbers, my message today to the large urban mayors was, let's continue to have a dialogue. Let's continue to consult, but let's focus on just this year. And in most cases, you're talking about 1% or less. And again, I asked those large urban mayors that if my numbers are not the same as theirs, to work with me, to continue to consult with me as we move forward. But there is, something that the Premier and our government talked about earlier this week in terms of a $7 million opportunity to do a line-by-line review. And I have to say that some of those mayors gave me some encouraging comments this morning that I think some of them are going to take advantage of our offer.
But you're cutting money, I guess. What I want to know is, you're cutting money from things like public health in this instance. You're asking them to look to find another 4% inefficiencies. Municipalities are not afforded the luxury that the province is, in that they are not by law allowed to run a deficit. Is that fair?
As someone who was in their chair, I focused today not on that 4-cent number that you just quoted. I'm focusing on my meeting today and with my municipal partners on the in-year challenges that they face. And for the most part, it's under 1%. Some may be closer to that 1 cent on the dollar. And that's what I want them to focus on. And yes, I understand. Some of them have talked about raising taxes. Some of them have talked about cutting services. I would hope that they would go back and look at their budgets, look for opportunities, look for, perhaps a way to do business differently. Bashi, the financial hole that we were left with from the previous government required that the status quo was no longer the way to go. We have to look at different ways to transform services. We have to look at different ways of doing things. And I know better than anyone the challenges that are faced by Ontario municipalities in year after they've done their budgets. If I could change the fact that, our fiscal year and theirs are different, I would.
Why did your government do what you did when you did it? I take your point on the size of the deficit. I understand that. But you know what it's like to have set out your fiscal plan for the year, including things like public health, which is important to a lot of people that live in this province, right? You know what that's like. Why did you make it so that those changes had to be retroactive?
Every speech and every time I've faced a stakeholder in my ministry, I've talked about the challenge that our government has had. We went through every line of every program and every service, and in every opportunity I told my stakeholders I wanted them to do the same. And yes, we have some challenging fiscal environment for our government. We were saddled with a deficit and a debt that was astronomical, and we want every single partner and every single stakeholder to work with us to get through it. It is extraordinary circumstances to have a provincial government in this deep of a hole, but we want everyone to work with us. And again, my comments today were around the in-budget challenges for 19 and 20 with our local mayors in our largest communities. I want them to look at every line, every program, to see if we can get through this year and continue to consult on some of those transformative items.
I take your point that you're talking about this year alone and that you want to work together with them, but that's not what we're hearing from them. Clearly, you have made budget projections out into the future, too, that would include further cuts. I understand that you want them to focus just on this year. The statement that came out of your meeting today from the Large Urban Mayors Caucus of Ontario was that big city mayors from across Ontario continue to be alarmed about the province's unilateral retroactive cuts to municipal funding after cities have already passed our budgets. It doesn't sound like they believe your government truly wants to work together.
Well, we do. And I made it very clear at the meeting this morning that we want to continue to consult. Listen, from the first meeting I had with AMO, I changed the every 2-month AMO-MOU consultation that the previous government put in place to go monthly. The last meeting we had with AMO, we had 13 items on the agenda. And yes, I agree. I'll be the first person to agree, Vashi, that our government is moving at a tremendously quick pace. And perhaps what we'll have to do now with our municipalities is really sit down with them at the AMO-MOU table or in Toronto at the TOCA table and actually do a deeper dive on some of these changes.
Shouldn't you have done that before? With all the respect in the world,
I don't have any more money
you?
for this year, Vashi. I just don't.
But you can run a deficit, they cannot.
Again, the fiscal hole that every minister was faced with, that every program and every service needed to be under the microscope. And all I'm asking municipalities for this year is to look at that very small 1% or under, and let's get through this year. Let's get through the fiscal pressure of this year, and let's pledge to work together on some of those bigger transformative items. That's what I asked today.
I understand. Are you sure it's just 1%? What the details that Toronto released about their budget look to be like a substantial chunk of change.
Again, I look at the Toronto number. I pledge to Mayor Tory that if his numbers and my numbers don't jive, please let me know. But the numbers that I see show around the 1% level for all municipalities. In many, many cases, it's well under that 1%.
Are you worried about the public reaction to the decisions that your government has made? I want to go over some of the results from 3 various polls. A recent one from Main Street found that the Premier has a lower favorability rating right now than Kathleen Wynne had before the last election, that you're down 11 points from June of 2018, according to Ipsos. The Environics poll said 3 out of 4 Ontarians think Premier Ford's government is on the wrong track, due in part to unpopular budget cuts. Are you worried about the impact your decisions are having on the way in which your government is being perceived?
I agree with the Premier that the only poll that counts is Election Day. And again, there are a number of polls out there. The challenge that we have and the guiding principle, whether it be through the President of the Treasury Board or the Finance Minister, we had to make some big decisions, some very, very tough decisions to protect programs that matter most to Ontarians. And I want our municipal colleagues, people that are watching this program, people who are at home, we're talking in year this year a very small amount, 1% or less. That's the figure we want municipalities to go back to the drawing board. But again, I want to pledge that we have a very substantial consultation process. Not to say it can't be always improved.
Not prior to this.
We're going to continue to work, and I just don't have the funds to be able to press that pause button. It's just not possible.
Okay, I'm out of time, but I have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Minister Clark. Appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you, Vashi.
Mayors from more than 24 Ontario municipalities gathered today in Guelph, and they are pleading with Ford to postpone the cuts. One of those mayors, Toronto Mayor John Tory, joins me now from Toronto. Hi, Mayor Tory. Nice to see you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Vashi.
So we interviewed Minister Clark, as I think you heard the clip there. He essentially made the argument that he just wants cities to focus on this year, and that it amounts to about 1% of your budget to look into cutting. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, for us, it's $177 million, but much more important than that. It is cuts that were made known to us unilaterally in the middle of the year, long after our budgets were approved. And our budgets were approved and tax rates set on the basis of money that had been historically coming to cities, plural, including Toronto, but all the other major cities in Ontario, on the basis of agreements and arrangements that had been in place for years. And so I think most people out there watching around the country will know that when you have a business, when you have a family, and somebody suddenly comes along and says, you know that money you've been relying on, and they tell you this halfway through the year, well, it's not going to be there anymore, and we're telling you that by way of a surprise. I think most people know that makes it virtually impossible to actually, go about in an orderly, business-like fashion the kinds of reductions that they've talked about. And so I just think that most people know that what we've put forward as a reasonable proposition, we as cities, we will sit with you. We will work out efficiencies that we can find in different areas, hopefully without cutting services that are important to people, but we have to do it together, and that means the time between now and, say, 2020 to look at those efficiencies, not doing it all of a sudden in the middle of the year.
Minister Christine Elliott was on the show yesterday, and she made the argument that, look, the Ford government did not make a secret of it during the campaign, that they were worried about the size of the deficit, that they were going to be making cuts, and essentially that municipalities should have known that they would be implicated in that somehow. What do you think about that?
Well, I would say that if they'd come out and said during the course of the election campaign, and I say this particularly of the MPPs who are elected in the city of Toronto, I can only speak about our city, that they were going to dramatically cut childcare subsidies. They were going to dramatically cut public health, which in Toronto, Ontario terms means student nutrition programs. It means vaccinations. It means restaurant inspections. It means kids' dental checks. If they'd come forward and said that kind of thing, I tell you, I don't think they'd have done half as well in the election as they did, because they made it sound, even on budget day, as if this was all, sort of just painless stuff, and they were proud of the fact that they weren't increasing any taxes. And I'm happy about that too, except what they've done is jammed all that down onto the municipalities, so that the very same taxpayers, whether they be municipal or provincial, will end up paying more taxes or end up losing services when they bring these cuts in the middle of the year, long after our budgets were approved and the tax rates set.
Is it the cuts that you have an issue with, or the timing of them? And I'm asking because the deficit is big, and there is a lot of money that goes towards servicing debt in Ontario particularly. Do they have a point that they have to attack that deficit in some way or form?
I have acknowledged the fact that they did say they were going to do that, and that we would like to partner with them. But the word partner is something that is foreign to them, I think, because that involves actually sitting at the table and saying, look, we have a problem here. How do we together try to solve this? And then hopefully you can find ways to do that without savaging childcare subsidies and without savaging public health and putting people's health at risk. And you can sit down and work on it together, instead of this notion where we get these kind of unilateral emails in the middle of the night saying, guess what? The money you counted on to provide for childcare in partnership with us, which has been going on for years, is suddenly not there anymore. It's just no way to do business. It really is almost impossible. And Mr. Clark in particular, having been a mayor of a city in Ontario, knows this.
What about, help me understand one discrepancy. We've asked a number of ministers, especially around the public health cuts, because your city put out exactly how much you thought of a hit your budget would take. And I think it was in the neighborhood of $64 or $65 million.
That's
they
right.
insist that it's $33 million. What's the discrepancy there? And have you made any movement with them? Minister Clark said that he would listen to you if you told him what the difference was.
Well, the difference is, and it's an eye-glazing thing for the viewers around the country, but difference is, what the numerator and the denominator are. And they keep citing, you see, that they're going to give us a certain amount for public health this year. And indeed, they're going to give us that amount, but it is less than the percentage they would have previously provided of the total healthcare expenditure, because we do it on a cost-shared partnership basis, and they've just unilaterally changed that, and they're going to change it for the future even worse and treat Toronto worse, frankly, than any other city in the province. So our professional public service, not politicians, professional public servants, have said it's $64 million. And you know what? As between a competition between those folks and what they're trying to peddle and our professional public servants, I will go with our professional public servants who say it's $64 million.
Minister Elliott also said that she didn't want any sort of essential services cut. I brought up the idea of vaccines, of clean water. She said that the city would have to make changes without affecting those, and that she sent a letter to set up a technical working group to discuss those cuts. Will you be discussing that with her? Are you part of that group?
Well, of course, we'll sit down and talk about how to do things better with them. But the point I guess I'm making, and all the other mayors, not just me, is that we should be sitting down on this entire thing from the beginning and this is what we're saying should happen now, it's never too late, to sit down and discuss their financial problems and the need they have to achieve efficiencies and do things better, and that on both sides we can find ways to do that, and you do that without hopefully affecting things like vaccinations and kids' dental checks and student nutrition programs. But, you know, for her to send a letter and just say, well, you know, we've decided that you're going to make these changes, to me is not the kind of spirit of partnership that I think the public expects from us, and halfway through the year puts us in an absolutely untenable position.
They've offered to pay for a line-by-line audit, an external auditor. Will you take them up on that offer?
I've said I wouldn't mind. I mean, I'm not objecting to it, but again, my point stands, which is that even if you had that auditor come in to help, we should be both sitting at the table and both examining these cost-shared partnerships on childcare and on public health and so on, and doing it together. Rather than, and you know, if you think about it, if we appointed an auditor tomorrow morning, it's going to take them 3 or 4 months to do their work, and then they submit a report, say in October or November, and then we're doing even worse, which is trying to bring about so-called efficiencies 11 months into the year. That's the whole problem with them having made these cuts retroactive for 2019, is that we have no time essentially halfway through the year to achieve these efficiencies in time to make up for what they've cut.
A series of polls have shown that some of these decisions have proven to be unpopular for the PCs. They've dipped in the polls as a result, to the benefit of the Liberals. Are you sticking in this job? Would you ever consider running for the leadership of that party?
Well, I consider myself to be the leader of the Toronto party, and I'm not sure around the country there'd be a lot of votes for that party. But having said that, my job is to speak up for the people of Toronto and to stand up for them, and I'm doing that. And the government's response has in many cases been very nasty and very sort of demeaning and disrespectful of the fact that we are a duly elected government here in a city of almost 3 million people, and that I believe the economy of our city, I believe the health and well-being of our city are going to be adversely affected by these unilateral cuts made halfway through the year. And I've made at the same time a very good faith offer to sit down with them now and to work together on achieving the kinds of efficiencies I understand they have to achieve, but do it together and do it in time for 2020, whatever those are. And hopefully they wouldn't affect childcare and they wouldn't affect public health. There are other things we could work on, or even the way we do those programs together. And they have just kind of dismissed that with the back of the hand.
I would note that's not a no to the question.
Look, I would only note that I've got my job to do here and I'm fully engaged in it, and I think people know that, and I just wish they would realize, looking at the very same polls you talked about, they're paying a terrible price because, back to what we said earlier, none of those MPPs were elected on a platform where they told people they were going to cut childcare, cut public health.
But they did say they were going to be trimming spending. I mean, I take your point, and they said no one would lose their job, and I've asked them that question many times.
How's that going?
But no, I agree. But I mean, I've asked those questions. But they didn't make a secret of the fact that they thought the deficit was a huge problem.
And nothing stopped them. They did not make a secret of that. I've acknowledged that. I even acknowledged the existence of the problem. But nothing also stopped them from sitting with us and working out a program that, because it's not as if they're trying to get rid of their deficit in 1 year. They're doing it in 4 more years. So they have the time to do this in partnership with us and to, I think, frankly, have their own political fortunes not go into the tank, which is happening now, because I think people see them treating all cities across Ontario, including Toronto, with disrespect and in an unbusinesslike way. And I just think people don't like that.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.